Hey everyone, it's Ladine from Sugar Stitches Quilt Co. Today I've got part 2 of my quilt binding series featuring my new Baby Lock Ballad sewing machine. In part 1 of the series, I covered some of the basics of quilt binding and the most common questions that I receive as a YouTube creator, blogger, and quilt pattern designer. If you haven't seen that video, I've linked it above here for you to go back and watch that, where I do cover the basics of binding and the most commonly asked questions. In the second part of the series, in this video, I'll be covering my actual process for quilt binding, step by step, showing you some of the tricks and tips that I've learned along the way to make binding easier and far less intimidating. Now, of course, as everyone knows, you will have your own preferences when binding your quilts, so do what's best for you. I'm going to show you my process, but that may not work for you. So watch through my process, see what you like, and try it out if you want. Because over time, mastering a skill has to be something that works for you. I'm a self-taught quilter, and I found that no matter how many times I might see a video or demonstration of a certain technique, if it didn't work for me, then it was useless. And all it did was cause frustration. So I encourage you to take the information that you learn, practice, and then find what works for you and use that. And soon you'll be comfortable binding your quilts and it won't be such a horrible task. So let's jump into my process on quilt binding. Okay, I have my binding strips already cut to 2.5 inches, and I have the number of strips needed for my quilt. And I want to show you a little trick that I have learned helps me save a lot of time when joining my binding strips before pressing them. So I like to open them up, so I just have one piece of fabric, and I like to lay about 3 strips on top of each other. More than that, then they start to shift, and make sure that you're comfortable cutting. And I'll line up the edges and then about an extra 3 to 4 inches after that, and make sure your raw edges are lined up as well as your edges here. And then the ruler that I use it's an easy angle by Simplicity. I've had this a really long time and it works for this purpose. I like that it's just a good solid ruler for general cutting. The important thing is it has this little notch you can see here in the corner, and that's what I use it for with this binding. So what I'm going to do is line up that corner where the little notch is, and then line up the ruler with my edge of my binding. And now we have this angle here. So essentially what we're doing is, this is the step that after you would sew your binding, typically in the traditional method, you would sew your binding and then cut the 1/4 inch seam. This is bypassing that. So we're going to cut this. And then you'll see we have this little extra that's waste. And then when I move these, you can see that we have the binding strips now cut at an angle with that notch at the bottom. So what happens is when we go to, and actually I'll just take 2 binding strips for right now. When we line them up, you can see that now we just take it to the sewing machine, sew our 1/4 inch seam. There's no marking or having to sew corner to corner, then trim. Essentially, you were just sewing a 1/4 inch down this line, and then we're done. There's no trimming necessary after that. And I'll show you that when we're done. But this is how I like to cut them. This notch is extremely important though, because when we open it up, then that has taken care of our seam allowance and everything will line up straight. So you'll see that when I sew them together and show you the end result. So that's my binding trick that I use for saving time cutting these, because sometimes I just have trouble making that line, lining everything up. This just seems simpler to me. And then I like to just put a pin there, and I'll take them all over to the sewing machine to sew that 1/4 inch seam all at one time. So I'm going to finish these up and then we'll take them to the sewing machine. Okay, all of my binding strips are cut, and they are cut at an angle. And I showed you that I like to put a pin there, but sometimes these can get a little hard to sew when you are at your sewing machine, because the feed dogs will tend to not want to sew evenly in these little corners, and we're sewing so close to the edge on a biased edge of fabric that I use my secret weapon for binding multiple times in the binding process, but this is first time, and that is Elmer's school glue. Now I like these precision pins, and they just simply have a little tip at the end. You can see that helps me just use a dot of glue when I need it. And then I also use this in another area of my binding that I'm going to show you a little bit later. Now you really can use any fabric safe glue. I don't mind using Elmer's school glue because it's washable, and I'm going to be washing my quilt, and I've never had any problems using it in my binding. And it's a really great way to make sure that your seams, or maybe you're using it for intersection of points, binding, whatever it is, stays in the position that it needs to stay for you to sew. And the key is to not use a lot at all. You do not need a lot to hold your fabric in place. Now, the other important thing with glue basting, people ask me, probably the most common question is does it gum up your machine? And the answer to that is no, it does not, as long as you don't use too much. And then my second tip for using glue in quilting is to always heat set it. And that's just to press it gently with your iron, just a little bit to dry that glue, and it sets it and it doesn't move. There's no point to using glue in quilting if you don't heat set it. So what I like to do, I've got my fabric piece here that we're going to be sewing together, and I will just put a few dots of glue. And if you even want to use the tube of glue, you could do that too. It's so easy, and there's really no rules to it. So we're just going to put a couple of dots of glue there, and then I'm going to take my second binding strip. Remember that we cut in the same direction, and I'm going to flip it over so we're right sides together. Then I'm going to place that exactly where I need it to go. I just had a little bit of glue that came out, so I just brush it with my fingers so that it doesn't touch my iron. And then you just take your iron and press it. Do not move it back and forth. So we've heat set that. You could still put a pin if you wanted to technically, but you don't need it because now they're held together, and you can see the final result of that after we sew that. So I'll do this for each of these binding pieces and then take them all over to the sewing machine at one time. Makes things a lot quicker. Okay, I am at my sewing machine with all of my binding strips glued together, and I just carefully take them over after heat setting them, and then you can see they're staying together pretty well as long as you're careful with them. And then I will actually just chain piece all of them together. I already have my digital dual feed walking foot on my Baby Lock Ballad. This is what I will use to attach my binding to my quilt. You don't necessarily have to have your walking foot on to sew your binding together, but I do find that it does feed everything through easier. And as I mentioned, when you're sewing on these biased edges, that's really important. So I went ahead and put it on right now so that I can sew my binding and then attach it to my quilt. And as I mentioned, you'll sew 1/4 of an inch on each of your binding pieces. All right, now all of my pieces are attached by the single thread since I chain pieced. So I will take this over to the pressing station to trim those threads, and then we'll talk about pressing the binding strips. All right, so I have all of my binding pieces sewn together, and as I mentioned, we need to trim those threads that are in the middle. And because we cut the binding strips ahead of time, we don't have to worry about cutting the 1/4 inch mark, as I mentioned. So that's already done for us. Okay, so I have all of my binding strips separated from being chain pieced, and we'll go to our first intersection. And normally you would just be able to easily open this seam allowance to press it open and reduce the bulk. You can go through here depending on how much glue you use. This is why I recommended that you not use a lot. You can just separate that sometimes with your fingernail or a small tool like a stiletto and pop that glue dot open so that you can press your seams open. You do want to be careful though, because these are biased edges and we don't want to stretch the fabric too much. If you're like me, I don't mind some of that bulk in my binding. I don't really notice that it makes a lot of difference. And so a lot of times I'll just go ahead and press my seams to one side. And as I mentioned, I don't notice a huge amount of difference in the bulk of my binding. And then there we have our binding strip. And then we'll just continue on. If you do decide that you don't want to press these to one side and you want to press them open, then I would encourage you to make sure that you do not use a lot of glue and maybe only in like 3 spots on the binding. And then it won't be as hard to open them up to press. Because they were heat set, then the glue is much easier to open. You can see this one is kind of already opening up a little bit. It's much easier to open because that glue is dried. But again, there's no quilt police, so you do what is best for you and your quilt. I've just noticed for me that, as I mentioned, it doesn't add too much bulk to my quilt, and to be honest, it saves time too. Okay, so now all of my intersections are pressed, and I like to press my binding in half. You don't have to do that. You can take your binding over to your quilt and attach it with it open and then fold it as you're sewing it around your quilt. I find that it's much easier to do here at the sewing machine. It's less to wrestle with at the sewing machine. And now we're going to go ahead and press our binding in half. And now we'll just continue pressing our binding in half. And here I'm coming to one of the edges that I joined, and when you see the binding pressed to one side versus pressed open, you'll notice that it's not a lot of extra bulk there. That's why I don't mind it sometimes. Okay, now I'm finished with my binding strips, and I'm going to take these over. I'm going to get my quilt ready, and let's attach it to the quilt. Now this is the quilt that we're going to be binding. This is my Shortbread Bites quilt pattern, and this particular version was done in Ruby Star Society fabrics, and I am just in love with this quilt, so I can't wait to get the binding on it. And take a look at this really pretty panto that my long arm quilter Debbie of Spare Threads has done. It's a really cute modern look, and I am excited to get the binding on this version. So what I like to do is make sure that my edges are pressed nicely so that everything is nice and flat for us to be able to put our binding on. Sometimes if you have any edges that are starting to open, you can actually baste around the edge of your quilt. Some people prefer to do that, or even serge all of the edges of your binding. It really holds everything together. This quilt, we used a thin batting on it, and so it is staying together nicely for my binding. So like I said, I just like to go through and press some of those edges and make sure they're all flat and ready for my binding. Okay, here we are at my sewing machine. I have my digital dual feed foot on my Baby Lock ballad, as I mentioned. I really like the digital feed because it has a belt inside, if you can see here. It really feeds all of the layers of your quilt through so much better than just a regular walking foot. So I love this feature on my Baby Lock ballad. I do use it to not only quilt with, but then I use it to attach my binding as well. And then I don't get any of those little puckers that you may get, or any issues with the top and the bottom fabric being fed through properly. Now I like to attach my binding to the back first and then bring it to the front. In video 1 of this binding series, I did cover attaching it to the back first or attaching it to the front first. I like to attach it to the back and then pull it to the front and sew it down, and then that gives me more opportunity to be creative. Again, it's your quilt, you choose what's best for you. Today I'm going to show you on this quilt, which is my process of attaching binding, and that is almost always attaching it to the back first, pulling it to the front. I just have a white thread on my top thread, and I have a white thread in my bottom thread because these will not be showing. Okay, so now I have my binding strips ready, and I like to leave a good bit of a tail before I start stitching, and that's just so that I have more room to work with it to join my edges. And then I start a little further down than about halfway through my quilt so that my binding will end up joining about the middle of my quilt. And that's purely your decision. It really doesn't matter where you start. What you do want to take note of, and sometimes I'll just casually lay this out before I start stitching, you don't want one of your binding joining edges in the corner of your quilt. So just on one side before you get started, just lay it out and make sure that you're not going to end up with that joining edge on the corner, because then it's going to be very bulky and very difficult to work with. So as long as I know that I'm good there, then it doesn't really matter where you start. And like I mentioned, you're going to leave a tail. How much you leave is really up to you. And then we'll just line up the raw edges, and we'll be sewing 1/4 of an inch on our binding. I like to put one quilting glove on, and it helps me feed this part of my quilt through a bit easier. It helps me grip my fabric over here as I'm guiding the quilt through. Purely optional, but just something that I have found that really helps me. So after lining or binding up, hold on a minute, I need to take my shoe off before I start sewing. Going to put our needle down, and then I like to take a few stitches and then back stitch a little bit when I get started. And just secure that. Okay, and you can see that we have our tail over here on the other side that is not sewn. We're starting down, like I said, about 10 inches or so, give or take, and that's purely up to you and what you feel comfortable with in the end to join your binding ends. And then we'll just stitch along the edge, 1/4 of an inch. Okay, now let's stop and talk about our binding corners before we do this first one. Now the key with the corner of the binding and to make sure that you get those nice crisp mitered edges is a couple of areas. First, we want to make sure that we are stopping 1/4 of an inch before the edge of your quilt here. And then the other important area is that when you flip your binding and start sewing down the opposite side, you're sewing 1/4 of an inch in that area. And it creates what you really can't see, and I think this is why it confuses so many people, is it creates an intersection of seams right in this corner, 1/4 of an inch from the end. And that's what enables you to fold and get that mitered corner. So ideally, you want to be able to stop 1/4 of an inch and either stop, backstitch a little bit, or you'll see a lot of people will just sew off the edge, making sure that it's lining up with this corner. Now, I do not eyeball measurements very well. I like to mark almost everything. Some people think that that is a time waster, but for me, I know that I don't eyeball things very well, so it's much better that I measure everything. I have a little small Omni Grid ruler that I keep right next to my sewing machine, and I actually use this to measure the accuracy of my 1/4 inch seam, but I like it because it's small. It's only 6 inches, and you can see it's just an inch wide. So what I like to do as I'm going around my corners is take a friction pin and this little small ruler, and I line up my binding, and I'm not pulling it. You can see I still have my needle down. I just stopped my sewing. Needle down and just lay the binding down, and I see my edge here, and I match up my 1/4 of an inch. And even if I have to make sure that I'm on point here on the corner, make sure that corner is lined up, and we're 1/4 of an inch, and then I mark my binding right there. You can see the little mark. That gives me the exact spot that I need to stop. And again, this isn't mandatory that you mark this. It's just if you're having trouble with your corners, then I would suggest that you do this so that you can properly identify that 1/4 of an inch and not eyeball it until you become more comfortable. If you're like me, even though I should be comfortable at this point, I still can't eyeball. So I just take advantage of using this. It doesn't take very long when you're actually going through the process. It doesn't take very long, and to me, it's far worth stopping and marking that line before I finish. And again, you can either stop at that line, backstitch a little bit, and cut your threads, or I could stop here, sew off the edge, and I'm just showing you informally here. I wouldn't normally mark this line, but here's the corner of my quilt. So I would be sewing off the quilt in that area. So either way, it's up to you how you finish that edge. And then after that, cut your threads, and we'll talk about how to fold our binding and continue down the opposite edge. All right, and here I come to that line, and I like to just slow down so that I can make sure I'm getting right on that line. Stop there. As I mentioned, you can either just lock stitch that, back stitch a little bit if you want, and then you can raise your presser foot with your needle down, turn your quilt to get that 45-degree area on the edge, and then sew off the edge. Or you could cut your threads, up to you. And then now we want to cut our threads, and then you can see that I had my drawn line where I stopped, and then you can see where my stitch line goes off the edge to the point of my quilt. And then I like to arrange my quilt, lay it out flat on my sewing table. And then this is also important that we are folding the binding up to get that nice crisp edge. This is why it's helpful to sew on this diagonal, because it's giving you a stopping point of where you need to fold your binding. And we're folding it upwards. And if you look, the goal is to have your binding laying straight out to form a continuous line. We don't want to fold this a little too much over and then the binding's over here or in this area. We want this fold at a perfect 45-degree angle, and you'll be able to tell that that's the right way if your binding is exactly in line with the edge of your quilt. When I first started quilting and really wanted to become more comfortable with my binding, I actually would just press this a little bit just so that I knew everything is nice and pressed and flat for me to work with, because sometimes when you're at your sewing machine, working with the binding just becomes so cumbersome because you're trying to manage everything. This is why I don't like to sew open binding to my quilt, because I just feel like it's one more thing to fiddle with while you're at your machine. So once you have this angle in the right spot going off the edge, and as I mentioned, your binding is continuously matching where your quilt is, we're going to fold the binding back down. And I like to just put a finger here so that I'm holding that so it's not moving. And then I like to press with my finger and press it down. And now I have it straight across here. It's matching up with my corner angle here. And then as I lay it down, it's matching with my raw edge here. So you should have a nice little pocket of folded binding there. And as I mentioned, the key area to good mitered edges is happening underneath here where we can't see. So that's why sometimes it makes things difficult. And then if you'd like to, you could put a pin there to hold everything together. I like to put my pin over here so that I can start my stitching and not have to worry about moving my pin. And then we'll start at the top of our binding, 1/4 of an inch down, and continue on. So that's the secret to the corners. And I like to put my needle down so that I can just put that binding underneath there and start stitching. Okay, I am on the final side of my binding, and you can see that I have my area here where I started, and I like to leave a pretty good sized area, not too large, but I do like to give myself some room to work to join my ends. So wherever it is that I feel that I need to stop, I go ahead and back stitch or lock stitch and then cut my threads. And then we've got the sewn area, an open area with the binding, and then the area where we started. And I'm going to take this over to my workstation so I can show you better on how to join the ends. Okay, so here I am on my workstation where I have a lot of room to work, and this is really what I suggest you do. Lay out your quilt so that you can do this last section of joining your binding ends without having to maneuver your quilt. Now you can see I have the end where I started my binding, and then we have the end where I have a lot of leftovers. So the first thing I like to do is get rid of some of this leftover. Now I don't want to cut anything too debatable, too close until I'm sure. So I give myself a lot of overlap between the two, and then I just trim this. And that's just because this gets in the way. So as long as we have a good size overlap to work with, and you can see I have plenty right there, then we're good. Now that I've gotten rid of most of that, we need to decide where we're going to have our joined ends. Now you can see that this end is over here pretty closely to this edge, and I don't want it that close because I won't be able to join my edges. So I'm going to trim this section as well. And that's when I decide about where I want my join to be. I usually like to start about the middle, as I had mentioned before. So I am going to just trim this a little bit, probably right about here, so that I have room to work again with joining my edges. And I still have a good bit of overlap. But now we know that we need this overlap to be precise so that we can join the ends. So the first thing that you do, again, you have your two edges. First thing to do, lay your first strip on your quilt. Don't pull, don't do anything, just lay it nice and flat. And then we're going to take one of these cut edges of binding and open it up. We know that our binding is 2.5 inches wide because that's where we cut it. We want this overlap to be exactly 2.5 inches. If you don't want to use a piece of your binding, then you can also use a ruler. We're going to measure from the edge of this first strip, lay your binding down, and we want this perpendicular, lining up exactly with your raw edge of your first strip. And then you'll lay down the second strip, trying not to disturb the first strip. Now this is our overlap. Nothing is pulled, stretched, pinned, anything like that. And again, we want our overlap to be the 2.5 inches. If you had a ruler, you would put the ruler here instead too. You want that lined up with that raw edge. And this is placed down gently. Like I said, make sure you're not pulling, because that's our tendency sometimes to pull straight and taut, and it will end up messing up your measurements. So when you have that 2.5 inch overlap, we want to cut the second binding strip on this edge of the binding, and make sure you're only cutting through that piece of the binding. And we'll cut that. And now you can see we have a 2.5 inch overlap of the two ends of binding. And now we don't need this anymore, so we can put that to the side. And what I like to do now is just bunch up my quilt a little bit. I still do it pretty organized. And then I like to put a few wonder clips here at the bottom just to hold that together. And the reason that we're doing this is so that we have a little bit more area to work with these two edges of binding, and we're not having to wrestle with those two edges. Because as you've seen, we want to be able to lay everything out nice and flat so that we can match those edges. Okay, and this is another place that can get tricky when joining your binding ends, and that's placing them right sides together without twisting them. So I like to take one side first. I start on the right side, and as the binding is coming off, just open it up and place it flat down on your work surface. Then take the next side as it's coming off, open it up, and then place it right sides down. And then what we want to do is sew a line from corner to corner here. You guessed it, I like to mark that line. So I'm just going to place my ruler right along this edge, make sure I'm getting both edges. You don't have to draw the line. As I mentioned, I don't like to eyeball things. And then mark that. Then I like to put a couple of pins in that area, and then we'll sew on that line to join our binding ends. Okay, I am back from my sewing machine, and you can see that I have my sewn line where I drew the line there. And before we cut anything, we want to make sure that the binding, it wasn't twisted, that everything looks good. And then I also like to unclip that area, lay the quilt out flat, and make sure that after I trim there, that everything is nice and flat and there are no gaps and everything looks great. Obviously there's the overlap here that's getting in the way, but everything looks good. So now I know before I cut that everything is good there. So we'll just open that back up, cut that about 1/4 of an inch away from the sewn line, and you can either press that with the iron or you can finger press it open and then just lay it back down in half, press that, and there we go, a joined end with no gaps, no issues. And now I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and close everything up. Okay, so I have closed up my binding and now everything is stitched down and ready for the next step. Now, because I stitched my binding to the back, we're going to be turning it to the front and then stitching down in the front. And I have a couple of tricks that I want to show you about how to get perfect, beautiful binding and far less hassle. So you could just finger press your binding and then flip it to the front and use Wonder Clips. And that works perfectly fine, but I like to use my secret weapon again, and that's glue basting. I find that I get a much cleaner, crisper binding when I do it this way. So the first step is to actually press my binding to the front with my iron. And I like to do that. You can see already that it's a crisper look, and then it actually, in my opinion, folds better to the front. And then I'll show you how to attach that with the glue. So let me press this and then I'll be back to show you what we do to the front. And some people say that this is an extra step and not necessary to actually press the binding, but you can see it goes really quickly. I finger press before I get there so that there are no gaps or anything before I press it with the iron. And then in the corners, I just use the corner of the iron and press that as well, and then continue on. And finger pressing it before I get there just ensures that I can maneuver the iron much quicker as well, and that there's no gaps. Okay, and I'm already done and have pressed everything outwards away from the back of the binding, including my corners. And so now I'm going to flip my quilt over. And we're going to look at the front of the quilt. So one thing that I want to show you first is with the method of stitching your binding to the back and pulling it to the front, there is the stitch line on the front of the quilt from where we stitched on the back. So when you are pulling your binding to the front of the quilt, you want to make sure that you're covering that stitch line up. And that's why I like the 2.5 inch binding typically on my quilts, because I feel like I have plenty of room to pull it around, cover that, and then you can still see the fabric nicely that I've chosen for my binding. You would use in your bobbin thread something that matches or blends with your backing, and then your top thread will be your choice if you use a contrasting thread or something that blends in, but you will be able to see the stitches on the front of the quilt. So that's usually the biggest decision maker of whether or not you stitch it to the front or to the back, is if you want those stitches to show. I like my stitches to show because I feel like it adds character to the binding and to the quilt. Then it also gives me the opportunity to use decorative stitching if I want, which I show you in the 3rd video in this binding series. Now typically you could just pull this to the front and then use binding clips along here to hold it and then take it over to the sewing machine. I actually like to glue baste my binding, and if you haven't heard of this before, it is an extra step, but as I mentioned before, I feel like it gives it a crisp, more professional look to my binding, and it also keeps my binding in place when I'm removing those wonder clips and sewing around my binding. So I'll again use my Elmer's glue pen. All we're doing is putting a line of glue, and we're not using a lot at all. After you have that line, pull the binding to the front, making sure you're hiding that stitch line, and then heat set that. And I'm doing it, you can see I'm pulling the binding before I get to it, so I don't have to pull it as I'm ironing there. So it can really go quickly once you start going. I like to put a longer section than I just did. I'm showing you this on camera, but I'll put a longer line of glue and then just work my way down. And you can see already the binding looks so crisp, and it will really stay down nice and flat for us to stitch at the machine. And you don't really need any binding clips. I'm going to show you in how I do the corners in just a minute, and I do use binding clips for those just to make sure that they stay together, but technically you have the glue there that are holding them, so you shouldn't have to worry. So let me go ahead and move this over, and I'll show you how we're going to do a corner, and then I'll finish it all up so we can stitch it down. So what I like to do with my corners is I save my corner, the actual corner, and do the sides first, then fold the corner in. So I'm going to glue a little bit more of this side. You can see just pulling that down and heat setting it. I'm kind of going backwards here over me so I can make sure I get a good camera angle here the best I can. And then we're going to do this side. And again, I probably would be doing more, but I'm just trying to show you this on camera. Okay, and now we're left with our corner. And what I like to do is pull this taut first, and then fold the second section over and make sure that my corner is nice and crisp before I do any gluing, because if I need to readjust or move anything over, it's much easier to do it before you glue it. I will even press it in this direction sometimes to make sure that it's all lying flat just as I want it. Fold that corner over. A couple of threads there that I'm going to trim. Oops. And then fold the other side. And that's a really nice miter there. I'm just going to press it just a little bit to crease it. And then now I'm going to glue it down. And again, we don't need a lot of glue. I usually just glue this section, and then just a little dab right there in the corner. Fold it back down and then heat set it. Now you can see I don't have any glue in that top section of the binding where it's folded over itself. You can put some there, but I find that sometimes that leaks out. So that's where I mentioned that I just like to put a wonder clip right there in the corner, and it holds it together while I'm working. And then also, as I'm working with the whole quilt around the ironing board, it doesn't come unglued. I'm going to go ahead, and you can see that even as I'm moving the quilt, everything is still nice and held together with that glue. So I'm going to go ahead and finish the rest of the sides of my quilt. Okay, so here we are with our binding glue basted down. Look how nice and straight and flat it is. And there's my corners that are still clipped. And now we have the decision to make about what thread we will use to stitch the binding down. As I mentioned, you'll need to make sure that your bobbin thread is either matching or blending in with your backing fabric, because you will be able to see that right along the edge here. Of course, you can see that Debbie at Spare Threads, when she did the long arm quilting, she used a light blue thread. So I could even use something like that so that it's blending in with the rest of the quilt and not standing out. Now, the front of the quilt is what we want to showcase, and we have that opportunity since we are going to be stitching down on the front. Now, I have a lot of blues going on here. As I mentioned, she used a really pretty light blue thread on the panto for the long arm quilting, and then I've got a lot of blues in my binding. So I could use a white thread if I wanted it to blend a little bit more, or a lighter blue, but I actually found this really pretty royal blue that I think is going to look really pretty and bring all the colors together in the quilt. You can see there's a lot of blues in the quilt, and it's not going to stand out too much, but it will be an accent, and that's what I want. As I mentioned before, I like stitching down the binding to the front because it gives you so much of an opportunity to make a statement with your quilt and to really finish it off. I am not patient enough for hand binding. I wish I was, but I have accepted that I don't. So I try to make my binding stand out the best that I can. And sometimes that's with a thread that blends in. Sometimes it's something that is really going to be an accent to the quilt. In video 3 in this series, I actually will talk to you about how to use decorative stitches in your binding and go over more about using thicker thread. Now, this thread that I am using is a 28 weight thread, and so we'll talk more about that and the best ways to use a thicker thread in video 3 of the binding tutorial series. But you can use a 40 or 50 weight if you prefer. It's going to show up a little bit less, but I've decided to go with this 28 weight in this royal blue. I'm going to take you over to the sewing machine next to show you how I actually sew this down, but it's really easy. Because we have the glue, you can see that everything is laying nice and flat, so we're just going to stitch around the edges. It's going to be really simple. Also in video 3, I show you a few different presser feet for your machine that can make this job a little bit easier, but you essentially want to be able to sew just on the inside of your binding here to stitch it down. We don't want it too far out, because then this binding can flap open and then expose some of the threads. So we want it right along the edge, maybe about 1/8 of an inch. And even if you're using your regular pressing foot or your walking foot, you'll be able to identify a good spot that is just along that edge, and it makes sewing around the entire quilt so much easier. My digital dual feed foot on my baby lock actually has a place where I can just glide it along on the edge and my stitching is perfect. So I want to show you that. So let me get my machine set up with my thread and we'll go over there. Okay, we are at my sewing machine, and you can see I still have my digital dual feed foot on my machine, and that's what I'm going to keep. And I wanted to show you what I meant about the location of where we'll be sewing. As I mentioned, we want to sew just ever so slightly on the inside of this binding, not too far out. So it's really about 1/8 of an inch or so. As I mentioned, we will talk about various presser feet that you can use specifically for binding, or just judging how you can use your regular presser feet on your machine to get a good gauge. It really is best if you have some sort of a guide on your presser foot so that you can have a uniform look to your binding. So with my dual feed foot, I actually like to just have the binding edge guiding along this center section here. If you can see, this left portion of my foot just glides along as I'm sewing, and it's like I mentioned, it helps me make sure that I have a uniform stitch, that I'm not going all over the place as I'm stitching this down. I also have a baby lock binding foot, and I will show you that in video 3, but I like to use my dual feed so that I can make sure everything is feeding through evenly on the quilt. But the specialty binding foot is really a great option to use with this top stitch down binding technique. So I already have my thread in here, and I will put my needle down. I've lengthened my stitch length to a 3, and that will give me a little bit more distance in my stitches. And I like a 3mm stitch. Sometimes I'll even do a 4, depending on what kind of project I'm using. I think it just gives it a distinctive look on the binding, and it's still enough to hold it down. I'm going to lock my stitch and then start stitching. I'm going to go slow so I can show you how this works first as I'm going through with this foot. And you can see that I am just using that foot as a guide. As I mentioned with the binding foot, it actually is so much easier. And then I'm going to continue on, and I'll show you what I do when I get to the corners. I want to be able to stop and show you what this looks like so far. You can see that the blue is really blending in nicely, but then also you can see it nicely on some of these lighter areas, and the 3mm I think looks great. So I'm just going to keep going. Okay, and I'm coming to my corner. I moved my Wonder Clip already, and I like to slow down, and you can see where I have the intersection of this mitered corner, and I want to make sure that I'm at least stitching in this corner here of the overlap. I don't like to go too far past that because then it's going to put me too far in on this next portion when I go down. So I just like to make sure I get at least into this fold of the binding to secure that down. So I like to slow down when I get to this area. You can use a stiletto if you need to make sure that you don't get your fingers. And then even if you need to raise your presser foot and take a look in there, I see I need one more stitch. And then we'll raise our presser foot, needle is still down, turn the binding on, or turn the quilt. And then you can see I'm still in the perfect area here to start stitching down the next side, and then I'll just continue. All right, when I get to my beginning spot, I like to just trim that thread because I secured that stitch. I don't have to worry about it. And then I just stitch right up to that, lock my stitch, and cut my threads. Okay, so we are all finished with our binding. I actually chose a white thread for the back. You can see that even though it wasn't a pink, it blends in just perfectly. And my threads on the front look great. My corners are nice and mitered, and my stitches are consistent and even, and everything looks great. Now, when I do this method of pulling my binding to the front, I do like to go around all of the edges and make sure that there's nothing that I missed. If you do happen to have an area where you missed the binding edge, you can just take out a few of the stitches, take that section out, and then just re-sew that one section. You don't have to redo like the whole side or anything of that nature. But everything looks great, and I am super happy with how this turned out. And I'm glad that I chose this dark blue thread. You can see how that just gives it a little bit of something extra with those other blues, and it really blends in with the panto as well. So I am happy with this Ruby Star version of my Shortbread Bites quilt pattern, which I do have available in my store. So I hope you enjoyed following along with me on how I bind my quilts. And as I mentioned, don't forget that I have 2 additional parts to this binding series. Part 1 is the most commonly asked questions and problems with binding. This was part 2, and then part 3 is some tips and tricks on finishing your binding. As I mentioned earlier, with this method of pulling the binding to the front, you really have a lot of options, and that's what I show you in the 3rd video in this series. So I hope you enjoyed this behind the scenes look of how I do my quilt binding, and I hope that I offered you some tips and suggestions that you can use in your own practices. Do me a favor and give me a thumbs up if you liked the video, and leave me a comment and let me know what you thought. Was there something that you really enjoyed, or do you have additional tips that you'd like to offer the quilting community? Everyone would love to hear from you too. Thanks for watching this 2nd part of my binding series, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye for now.